In August of 1999, a company in Glenview, Illinois, shipped its first high-definition television set, a 64-inch rear projection model that represented everything American engineering had been building toward for a decade. That same month, the same company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in a federal courthouse 12 minutes from its headquarters. The company was Zenith. It had invented the wireless remote control. It had built what were, for decades, the best-selling television sets in the United States. It had developed the 8 VSB digital transmission system that the FCC had adopted 3 years earlier as the American broadcast standard, a technology now embedded inside every digital television sold in the country. And in the summer of 1999, Zenith was being sold for the price of its own debts. A Korean conglomerate called LG Electronics, formerly Lucky Gold Star, exchanged $200 million in claims against Zenith for 100% of the company's equity. Shareholders received nothing. Their stock was canceled. Everything Zenith ever was, every patent, every factory floor, every version of the plastic pistol-shaped remote control that a self-taught Chicago engineer named Eugene Pauly had built in 1955, all of it now belonged to someone else. The question is not whether Zenith deserved better. The question is how a company that invented the future went bankrupt the month it finally delivered it. You're watching Tech District, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like because the rise here is just as strange as the fall. The story begins on a kitchen table. In 1918, in Chicago, two amateur radio enthusiasts named Carl Hassel and Ralph H.G. Matthews pooled their equipment and started building radio sets for other hobbyists. They called themselves Chicago Radio Laboratory, and their entire manufacturing operation fit in a single room. Hassel ran an amateur radio station with the call letters 9ZN, and from those letters, they derived a brand name for the equipment they sold, Zenith. Commercial radio barely existed. There was no broadcast industry, no advertising model, no consumer market in any form that a modern viewer would recognize. Hassel and Matthews were not entrepreneurs in the way the word is used now. They were tinkerers who happened to be good at building things, selling to a community of other tinkerers who happened to want them. By 1920, the infant radio industry had begun to grow, and Chicago Radio Laboratory had outgrown the kitchen table. They moved into a small shack at 5525 North Sheridan Road, a 250-square-foot building on property owned by the Edgewater Beach Hotel. Half of it was the factory. The other half was the radio station. That was the entire company. Then, in 1921, a man who would reshape it walked through the door. Eugene F. McDonald Jr. was born in Syracuse, New York in 1886. He earned his first money as a boy reading electric meters. By the time he found Hassel and Matthews, he was already a self-made millionaire, a Navy veteran who had served in World War I and kept the title of lieutenant commander for the rest of his life. Everyone called him the commander. McDonald was not an engineer. He was a salesman, a showman, an Arctic explorer, and a relentless publicist who understood that the best way to sell radios was to make people believe that radios mattered. He entered into a partnership with Hassel and Matthews, brought capital the two men desperately needed, and demanded one change immediately. The brand name would no longer be Zenith. It would be Zenith, spelled out with a lightning bolt. In 1923, McDonald, Matthews, and Hassel incorporated the Zenith Radio Corporation. Hugh Robertson, a Scotsman who would serve as McDonald's financial counterweight for decades, joined as treasurer the same year. McDonald ran the vision. Robertson ran the books. Matthews left the company in 1928. Hassel stayed for 40 years. What followed was a decade of firsts that no American electronics company has matched in density. In 1924, Zenith introduced the world's first portable radio. In 1926, it released the first home radio receiver that ran on household AC current, eliminating the need for bulky batteries. In 1927, automatic push-button tuning arrived, and with it, a slogan that McDonald would stamp across every advertisement and every product for the rest of his life. The quality goes in before the name goes on. By the late 1920s, Zenith ranked 12th in a $400 million industry, and it was climbing. The Depression hit the radio business hard, and competitors folded across the country. McDonald survived by doing what most executives considered reckless. He kept investing in research and development. He kept launching products. He financed expeditions to the Arctic with explorer Donald Macmillan, equipping the ships with Zenith shortwave transmitters and broadcasting Inuit voices, singing into the microphone back to American living rooms. The publicity was worth more than any ad buy. Zenith radios became the brand of exploration, of reach, of signals that traveled farther than anyone expected. When the 1930s ended, Zenith was not just surviving, it was preparing to enter television. In 1939, the company launched one of the first experimental all-electronic television stations in the country. The following year, it established one of the first FM radio stations in the Midwest. WWZR, later called WEFM, named for Eugene F. McDonald himself. The station would be among the earliest to broadcast in FM stereo, beginning in June of 1961, using a multiplex system that Zenith developed and that the FCC authorized as the national standard. That system is still in use worldwide. Then the world intervened. World War II transformed Zenith from a consumer electronics company into a defense contractor overnight. The factories on Dickens Avenue in Chicago pivoted to radar equipment, communication systems, and high-sensitivity frequency meters for the military. Revenue climbed from $23.8 million in 1941 to $34.2 million in 1942, with $1.4 million in net income. The war years consumed resources, people, and time. When it ended, McDonald came back to television with an idea that was 30 years ahead of the market. In 1947, Zenith launched PhoneVision, the world's first subscription television concept. The premise was simple, and to McDonald, obvious. Viewers would pay for quality programming directly, the way they paid for a movie ticket, rather than watching shows financed by advertisers. McDonald despised commercials. He considered them an invasion of the viewer's home, a corruption of the medium he believed television could become. The broadcast networks, built entirely on advertising revenue, fought PhoneVision at every turn. Regulators sided with the networks. PhoneVision ran trials in Chicago, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut through the 1950s and 1960s, but the advertising model won. McDonald lost that fight decisively, but his hatred of commercials planted a seed that would bear fruit in a different form. If viewers could not escape advertisements through a subscription, McDonald reasoned, then Zenith would give them a tool to silence the ads themselves. The man who built that tool was Eugene Pauly. Born November 29, 1915, in Chicago, to parents of Polish descent, Pauly had no university degree and no formal engineering credentials. He walked into Zenith in 1935 and started in the stockroom. He moved to the parts department, where he produced the company's first catalog. Then he transferred to engineering. For 20 years, Pauly worked his way through radar systems, push-button car radios, and video disc prototypes, accumulating 18 United States patents along the way. And in 1955, McDonald gave him a specific assignment: build a device that lets a viewer shut off a commercial without leaving the chair. What Pauly built was the Flashmatic, a pistol-shaped handheld unit that fired a beam of directional light at 4 photo cells mounted in the corners of the television screen. Aim at the upper left, the set turned on or off. Aim at the lower right, the channel changed. Zenith's advertising promised the Flashmatic could shut off long, annoying commercials while the picture remains on the screen. The device was, by any measure, the world's first wireless television remote control. McDonald ordered it into production immediately and gave Pauly the President's Award. There was one problem. The Flashmatic could not tell the difference between Pauly's light beam and sunlight. On bright afternoons, Zenith sets changed channels on their own. Within a year, another Zenith engineer had designed a replacement. Robert Adler, an Austrian-born physicist with a doctorate and a reputation for brilliance, proposed an entirely different approach. His Space Command remote used tiny aluminum rods that, when struck by miniature hammers inside the unit, produced ultrasonic tones at frequencies too high for the human ear to detect. No batteries, no electronics, no light. The television's receiver contained a microphone tuned to the same frequencies. Adding the Space Command system to a Zenith set required 6 additional vacuum tubes in the television chassis and pushed the retail price up by roughly 30%. Consumers paid it anyway. The Space Command became the standard, the clicker, the device that redefined the relationship between a viewer and a screen. Adler's name replaced Pauly's in the industry press. The National Inventors Hall of Fame later inducted Adler as the inventor of the first practical television remote control. Pauly was never inducted. According to his son, the distinction ate at Pauly for the rest of his life. In 1997, the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences awarded Zenith an Emmy for the pioneering development of wireless remote controls. Pauly and Adler shared the stage. It was the only formal recognition that treated them as equals. The company that made television comfortable had given the world a tool that would reshape entertainment, computing, and human attention itself. But the same decade that produced the Space Command also produced Zenith's peak, and every peak in American electronics has a cliff on the other side. The force that would eventually kill Zenith arrived quietly, priced below cost, and packaged in cardboard boxes from Japan. Through the 1960s, Japanese television manufacturers had been building market share in the United States with sets that undercut American prices by margins that Zenith's engineers considered physically impossible. In December of 1970, Zenith and National Union Electric Corporation filed suit against Matsushita and 20 other Japanese companies, along with American importers, including Sears, Roebuck, and Company. The complaint alleged a 20-year conspiracy to fix artificially high prices in Japan and use the profits to subsidize below-cost dumping into the American market, all with the goal of driving domestic manufacturers out of business. Zenith's chairman, John Nevin, said it openly. The Japanese were selling televisions in the United States for less than they charged in Japan, and the motive was to take control of the market. The case became one of the longest and most expensive antitrust battles in American history. It ground through federal courts in Pennsylvania for more than a decade. By the end of 1983, Zenith had spent millions on the litigation alone. In March of 1986, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled for the Japanese manufacturers on the antitrust claims, holding that the evidence was insufficient to prove a predatory pricing conspiracy. In April of 1987, the court refused to hear Zenith's final appeal on the anti-dumping claims. The legal fight was over. The numbers told the rest. In 1960, Zenith and RCA each commanded more than 20% of the American television market. By the late 1970s, Japanese manufacturers collectively held the majority. Motorola had already sold its television business to Matsushita. RCA would be absorbed by General Electric in 1986, and its consumer electronics division sold off. One by one, the American television manufacturers surrendered or disappeared. Zenith refused. In 1977, when the company announced mass layoffs and began moving production to Mexico and Taiwan, angry workers held protests for weeks outside Zenith's Chicago factories and at the Daily Center downtown. The scene was familiar across American manufacturing that decade. No amount of anger could change the math. But Zenith's 1960s before the cliff were something worth remembering. The 1962 Illinois Manufacturers Directory lists Zenith Radio Corporation as having 11,000 employees, at least 6,460 of them spread across 7 Chicago plants. Plant number 1 at 6001 West Dickens Avenue employed 2,500 workers building radios, television sets, and hi-fi stereophonic phonographs. Plant number 3 on Costner Avenue housed 2,100 people producing government electronics and television components. 500 workers at the Grand Avenue plant built government hi-fi equipment. The Rowland Corporation subsidiary employed 850 people making picture tubes on Knox Avenue. Electronics and communications equipment had become Chicago's leading manufacturing sector, and Zenith was one of the primary reasons. The quality was not a slogan, it was an engineering philosophy. Zenith sets were built to last in ways that their competitors' sets were not. Hand-inspected, component-tested, designed to survive decades of daily use. The proof is the verdict of the people who bought them. Zenith console televisions from the 1960s still power on, in basements and living rooms across the Midwest, 60 years later, with original components. Collector communities buy, restore, and trade them. A mint-condition Zenith console in walnut fetches serious money at auction, not because of nostalgia, but because the thing still works. The transoceanic shortwave radio was Commander McDonald's personal obsession, born from his Arctic expeditions with Donald McMillan and refined through more than 2 decades of continuous production. It was a portable multi-band receiver designed for a world where information traveled by shortwave or did not travel at all. The vacuum tube models gave way to transistor versions in 1957 with the Royal 1000, and McDonald personally supervised every design revision of every generation. He shaped the controls, argued over the dial layout, rejected prototypes that did not meet his standards. Then, on May 15, 1958, McDonald died of cancer at the age of 72. Chief engineer Gilbert Gustafson died the same year. The 2 losses, back-to-back, left what one observer called a void of talent at the top that the company never fully replaced. Castro reportedly made a transoceanic his personal radio. The collector community is still active today, swapping parts, restoring sets, paying prices that would have shocked a man who spent his career making sure the quality went in before the name went on. Zenith reached its financial peak in the mid-1970s, with revenue approaching $978 million in 1975, driven primarily by dominance in color television. The Chromacolor picture tube, introduced in 1969 as the first black matrix color tube, gave Zenith a technical edge that competitors took years to match. By the early 1980s, annual revenue stabilized around $1.2 billion, but profitability was eroding under the weight of Japanese competition. In 1982, the company posted a net loss of $24 million on that $1.2 billion in revenue. The margin was gone. To counter the decline, Zenith made a move that looked shrewd at the time. In 1979, Chairman Jerry Perlman acquired the Heath Company, a longtime maker of do-it-yourself electronics kits, for $64.5 million. Heath had just announced its first personal computer kit, and Apple had introduced the Apple II only months earlier. Zenith Data Systems was born. By the mid-1980s, ZDS was winning contracts that startled the industry. It beat IBM for a deal with the Internal Revenue Service. It won major orders from the Department of Defense. Its SuperSport laptop, released in 1988, captured a quarter of the American laptop market in a single year. Revenue peaked at $1.4 billion in 1988, briefly larger than the entire television operation. For a moment, it appeared that Zenith had found its escape route. Then, in 1989, Perlman and the Zenith board decided to sell Zenith Data Systems to France's Group Bull for $511 million and use the cash to pay off short-term debt and some long-term obligations. The most profitable division Zenith had ever built, gone in a single transaction to fund one more stand in a television war the company was already losing. The television operation that remained had not turned a consistent profit in years. Zenith had just sold its future to finance its past. Stripped of its computer business and battered by 2 decades of Japanese competition, Zenith staked everything on one last invention. The technology worked perfectly. The company that invented it had months to live. Beginning in 1988, Zenith poured its remaining engineering talent and its dwindling capital into high-definition television. The bet was not irrational. American broadcasters were preparing for the transition from analog to digital, and the company or consortium that set the transmission standard would collect royalties on every receiver sold for decades. Zenith threw itself into the research with a focus that bordered on obsession. It was first to propose a partially digital television signal. It pioneered the use of broadcast channels that the industry had previously considered unusable, the so-called taboo channels, for digital transmission. It developed progressive scanning for computer-friendly displays when competitors were still designing for interlaced output. And in early 1994, after extensive competitive laboratory testing, the Grand Alliance, a consortium of the country's leading electronics researchers, selected Zenith's VSB technology as the terrestrial broadcast and cable transmission subsystem for American HDTV. In December of 1996, the FCC adopted Zenith's 8VSB system as the centerpiece of the ATSC digital television broadcast standard. In 1997, Zenith and the other Grand Alliance members earned a technical Emmy for their work. Every digital television tuner sold in the United States since that date has been built around an 8VSB chip licensed from Zenith. The company had invented the standard. It held the essential patents. It had won. You can read that two ways, and honest history holds both readings at once. One reading says Zenith was right about HDTV, right about the technology, right about the standard, and was simply too small and too damaged by decades of unfair competition to survive long enough to profit. The other reading says Zenith spent the 1990s chasing a technology whose mass market was still years away, burning cash it did not have on a future it could not afford to wait for, while the existing television business bled out underneath it. Both readings are true. The Supreme Court said there was insufficient evidence of a Japanese conspiracy. Zenith's workers and engineers, who watched their jobs move overseas, while Japanese sets appeared on American shelves at prices below the cost of American production, drew their own conclusions. What is not in dispute is the result. Winning a standards war means nothing if you cannot survive long enough to collect. By the time the FCC made its decision, Zenith was hemorrhaging cash at a pace that made the 1980s losses look modest. LG Electronics, the South Korean conglomerate formerly known as Lucky Gold Star, had purchased a 5% stake in the early 1990s. In 1995, LG paid $351 million for a controlling 58% share. The New York Times announced it under the headline, "Last U.S. TV maker will sell control to Koreans." That headline was not an exaggeration. Every other American television manufacturer had already exited or been absorbed. Zenith was the last one standing, and now it belonged to Seoul. The losses kept coming. $92.4 million in 1995, $178 million in 1996, $299.4 million in 1997. CEO Alvin Moschner resigned abruptly in July of 1996. His replacement, Peter Wilmot, announced the layoff of 25% of the remaining United States workforce, roughly 1,175 workers, and the indefinite postponement of a planned $100 million large-screen picture tube plant in Woodridge, Illinois. In 1997, Zenith attempted to revitalize its brand with a redesigned lightning bolt logo and a $10 million advertising campaign, its first in 5 years. It was a coat of paint on a collapsing structure. In 1998, Zenith posted a loss of $275.5 million on revenue of $984.8 million. That same year, it closed its last American manufacturing plant, the Melrose Park Picture Tube facility on the west side of Chicago, and put 1,200 workers out of their jobs. The company that once employed 11,000 people across 7 Chicago factories now made nothing in the United States at all. On August 23, 1999, Zenith filed a petition for reorganization under Chapter 11 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code. The filing came weeks after the company shipped its first HD TV set, a 64-inch widescreen rear projection model, and months after a failed venture with DivX pay-per-view DVD players, its last attempt at a new consumer product. There were only 70 digital television stations on the air in the entire country at that point. The market Zenith had spent a decade building was still years from maturity. The bankruptcy was prepackaged, meaning the outcome had been negotiated before the filing. LG Electronics, as Zenith's largest creditor, agreed to exchange $200 million in claims for 100% of the newly issued equity. Bondholders received new notes at a reduced rate. Shareholders received nothing. The stock was canceled. The Wall Street Journal reported that the shares would simply cease to exist. No distributions, no residual value. A company that had once generated $1.2 billion in annual revenue and employed 11,000 workers in Chicago alone was sold for the value of its own debts. On November 5, 1999, a federal bankruptcy judge confirmed the plan in a 45-page opinion. Zenith emerged as a wholly owned subsidiary of LG Electronics, no longer a manufacturer of anything, but a designer, a marketer, and a licenser of patents. Revenue that year was $444.7 million. The workforce had been reduced to 976 people. In 2000, Zenith sold its Network Systems division, the unit that made set-top boxes for cable and satellite providers, and one of the few remaining profitable operations, to Motorola. What remained was a brand and a portfolio of patents. The lightning bolt logo continued to appear on budget televisions and DVD players sold through discount retailers, but the products were designed and built by LG. Some were sold under other names entirely, including Admiral and Allegro. The headquarters moved from the old Glenview campus to a smaller office in Lincolnshire, Illinois. The Zenith that had built radios on a kitchen table in 1918. The Zenith that Commander McDonald had turned into a household name. The Zenith that Eugene Pauly had given the remote control was gone. What survives is scattered but stubborn. The 8VSB chip sits inside every digital television tuner in the United States, collecting licensing fees for a subsidiary in Lincolnshire, Illinois, that most consumers have never heard of. The FCC requires 8 VSB demodulators in all televisions 25 inches and larger sold in the country. Every one of them carries Zenith's invention. The engineers still working there continue to develop broadcast standards, contributing to the ATSC 3.0 specification that will define the next generation of over-the-air television and mobile broadcast. Zenith also developed the Pro-Idiom encryption system that secures HDTV content in hotels and hospitals across North America, a small but profitable niche that continues to operate. Zenith and LG together have more individuals inducted into the Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame than any other company, a distinction that belongs largely to work done in Chicago decades ago. In collectors' homes and repair shops across the country, Zenith televisions from the 1950s and 1960s still receive signals. The transoceanic still picks up shortwave from stations half a world away. Online forums dedicated to restoring Zenith sets remain active, and people who worked at the factories in the 1960s and 1970s still post their memories in the comment sections of history blogs, sharing stories of the assembly lines on Dickens Avenue and the engineering labs where Pauly and Adler argued about the best way to change a channel. The sets power on because the quality did go in before the name went on. The machines outlasted the company that built them. They outlasted the factories, the workers, the engineers, and the chairman, who insisted that the name be spelled correctly and the lightning bolt be placed just so. The Flashmatic sits in a different kind of museum now. Not behind glass, but in the bloodline of every remote control on Earth. The plastic pistol that Eugene Pauly built in a Chicago laboratory in 1955. The one that changed channels when you aimed it right and changed channels when the sun came through the window, led to the Space Command, which led to the infrared remote, which led to the device you are holding in your hand right now. Pauly died on May 20th, 2012, in Downers Grove, Illinois, at the age of 96. He was not in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Robert Adler, the physicist who replaced his design and received the credit, died in 2007 at 93. The company they both worked for exists today as a line item on LG Electronics' organizational chart, a research subsidiary in a suburban Illinois office park, staffing fewer than 1,000 engineers who develop technology that ships under someone else's name. Zenith invented the way Americans watch television. It invented the remote control, the subscription broadcast, the digital transmission standard. It refused to abandon American manufacturing longer than any of its competitors, and the cost of that refusal was everything. The industry Zenith helped build buried it without a headstone. If you owned a Zenith, worked on one, or grew up with one glowing in your living room, drop a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and whether it still turns on. The people who use these machines and the people who built them know more about what was lost than the people who sold it. If the stories behind American technology matter to you, subscribe. Tech District has the story of another company that changed the world and disappeared, and you will not want to miss how it ends.